Story 1. Michael Lee Wilson was born on February 28, 1975, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was raised by his mother, Patricia Taylor, in a neighborhood with a high level of crime and gang activity. His father played only a small role in his life, struggling with drug and alcohol addiction and failing to provide a positive example. As a result, Michael's mother became the primary caregiver for him and his siblings. Michael had two siblings, an older brother, James Leon Wilson, and a sister, Stacy Fenns. His older brother became involved with gangs while Michael was still young, exposing him to gang members and violent crime from an early age. He found himself in dangerous situations on several occasions. At one point, rival gang members opened fire on Michael and his brother, and Michael was shot in the leg. In another incident, a rival gang burned down his family's home. These experiences brought constant fear and stress into his childhood. Despite the violence surrounding him, Michael performed well in school. His teachers described him as respectful, intelligent, and fun-loving. He was also active in his church, where people knew him as a polite and respectful young man. Those who knew him noticed the contrast between these two parts of his life. In one environment, he was a church-going young man, while in another, he was surrounded by gangs and crime. As Michael grew older, he also struggled with his mental health. He suffered from depression, had difficulty concentrating, and sometimes heard voices. He experienced violent nightmares during which he would kick, punch, and shout in his sleep. He also suffered from severe headaches that could last for hours or even days. These problems continued throughout his teenage years and into adulthood. During this period of his life, he also had a girlfriend named Tanya Holt, and together they had a child. As he entered adulthood, Michael began having problems with the law. In October 1994, he was arrested in connection with a drive-by shooting. He was charged with a crime and later pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact to murder, meaning he had helped someone who had committed a murder. At one point, he was awaiting sentencing on that charge. Around the same time, police stopped him for a traffic violation, and during the stop they found a loaded handgun in the car he was driving. Together, these incidents showed that Michael had already become involved in criminal activity early in his adult life. Despite his legal troubles, Michael eventually found work at a Quick Trip convenience store in Tulsa. The store was located at 215 North Garnett Road, where he worked alongside other employees on various shifts. Over time, he became familiar with the store's daily operations, including where money was kept and how the security system worked. Having worked there for some time, he knew the routines and procedures well, and he also became familiar with his co-workers and the regular customers who came in during his shifts. Michael Lee Wilson worked at the Quick Trip convenience store and knew its operations extremely well. He knew where the safe was located, how the cash register worked, and where the security camera recorded everything. He also knew that his co-worker, Richard Kevin Yost, regularly worked the night shift. Yost was 30 years old and had been employed at the store for about 3 months. He had a wife and 2 young sons, and he hoped to one day become the store's manager. About 2 weeks before the crime, Wilson and 3 of his friends began discussing a plan to rob the Quick Trip. The 3 friends were Darwin Demond Brown, Billy Don Alverson, and Richard Harjo, who was only 16 years old at the time. Over the course of about 2 weeks, the 4 men planned the robbery, deciding what they would do and how they would carry it out. Wilson understood that if they robbed the store while Yost was working, Yost would be able to identify them. Because Wilson worked at the store, Yost knew him personally, and Wilson also believed Yost could recognize the other 3 men if they entered the store. As a result, the plan was not simply to rob the store. It also involved killing Yost, so he would not be able to identify the robbers to the police. Wilson later admitted that he knew Yost would be killed as part of the plan. About a week before the crime, Richard Yost became concerned. He believed Wilson and his friends were planning to rob him, and his fears became serious enough that he asked a police officer to increase patrols around the store. He told the officer that he believed Wilson and his friends intended to rob him. Police were aware of his concerns and increased patrols in the area, but no one stopped Wilson or the others before the crime took place. On February 25, 1995, at 11 p.m., Wilson finished his shift at the Quick Trip just as Richard Yost arrived to begin his own. The two men were together at the store briefly, while Wilson left and Yost took over the night shift. Wilson went home or to another location, but he did not stay away for long. During the early morning hours of February 26, 1995, Wilson returned to the Quick Trip with Brown, Alverson, and Harjo. The four men entered the store together, but they did not attack Yost immediately. Instead, they remained inside for nearly an hour while customers came and went, waiting until the store was empty so no one would witness what they were about to do. While they waited, Wilson casually spoke with Yost. During their conversation, Wilson asked him what kind of future he believed he had with the company. Yost replied that he hoped to manage the store someday. Wilson laughed at his answer and asked, "For real?" That conversation took place only about 14 minutes before the attack began. Once the last customers had left, the four men surrounded Yost as he cleaned the windows on the store's coolers. They attacked him and dragged him into a back room, or cooler area. Yost fought back and tried to escape, but he was outnumbered 4-1 and was quickly overpowered. The men handcuffed his wrists and bound his ankles with duct tape, so he could neither move nor run away. While Yost was being restrained, Alverson returned to the front of the store. He picked up items that had been knocked off the shelves during the struggle and watched for any customers who might enter. A short time later, Alverson and Harjo walked out through the front door together. As they left, Yost began yelling and screaming for help, possibly believing a customer had arrived who could rescue him. However, Alverson and Harjo soon returned, and this time Harjo was carrying a black aluminum baseball bat. He took the bat into the cooler where Yost was being held. The store's surveillance camera did not capture what happened inside the back room because it only recorded the front area of the store. However, its audio system picked up the sounds coming from the cooler. The recording captured the sound of the bat striking Yost. During a period of 131 seconds, just over 2 minutes, Yost was hit 54 times. He suffered repeated blows to his head and body. He tried to protect himself by raising his hands over his head, but the bat struck the handcuffs on his wrists. A piece of metal from one of the handcuffs was later found embedded in his head, and fragments of the handcuffs had been driven into his skull by the force of the blows. Throughout the attack, Yost begged for mercy, but none was given. While Yost was being beaten to death in the cooler, Wilson walked out of the back room and checked his hands, possibly to see if there was blood on them. He then put on a Quick Trip jacket with Yost's name on it, went behind the counter, and began trying to pull the safe out from underneath it. At the same time, he took money from the cash drawer and the currency change machine, including multiple rolls of $5 bills. As Wilson worked behind the counter, customers continued entering the store. He remained calm and greeted them in a friendly manner, selling them their purchases as though nothing unusual had happened. He thanked them, told them to come again, or wished them to have a nice day. The customers had no idea that a man was dying in the cooler only a few feet away. Between serving customers, Wilson continued pulling on the safe until he was eventually able to move it. After the beating had ended, Wilson left the counter area and removed the videotape from the surveillance camera recorder so police would not be able to review footage of the robbery and attack. The four men then used a dolly from the store to load the safe, along with the stolen money, into Wilson's car. They left the store with the safe, the money, the videotape, and other stolen items. Yost's body was left on the floor of the cooler, lying in a pool of spilled milk, beer, and his own blood. His ankles remained bound with duct tape. One handcuff was found near his body, but the other was missing. The crime was both brutal and swift, lasting only a few minutes in total. At around 6 a.m. on February 26th, customer Larry Wiseman entered the store and found no attendant at the front counter. After looking around, he discovered Yost's body in the walk-in cooler. Yost was dead. Wiseman immediately called the police, and officers responded to the scene. When investigators arrived, they began speaking with witnesses and learned that Michael Wilson had been at the store between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. that morning. They also discovered that Wilson was scheduled to return to work at 3 p.m. later that same day. Although police immediately began watching for him, they did not arrest him at that point because they were still gathering information. Michael Wilson did not report for his scheduled 3 p.m. shift on February 26, 1995. This was unusual because he was expected to work, and when he failed to appear, the officers investigating the murder took notice. Officer Wayne Allen set up surveillance outside Wilson's house, waiting to see if he would return home. At about 4 p.m. that same day, Officer Allen saw Wilson getting into a gray vehicle outside the house. The vehicle drove away, and Officer Allen followed it before stopping it a short time later. Inside were Wilson, Billy Don Alverson, Darwin Demond Brown, and Richard Harjo. All four men were taken into custody immediately and arrested for the Quick Trip robbery and the murder of Richard Yost. When officers searched the men, they found large amounts of cash on all of them except Wilson. Among the money were multiple rolls of $5 bills. Investigators also discovered that the men had purchased new pairs of Nike Air tennis shoes, and the price tags were still attached. This indicated that they had gone shopping with the stolen money shortly after the murder. After his arrest, Wilson was questioned by Detective Charles Folks. Although part of the interview was recorded, another portion was not. During the unrecorded interview, Wilson confessed to the crime. He told Detective Folks that he and the other three men had been planning the robbery for about 2 weeks. He admitted that he knew Richard Yost would be killed as part of the plan, and explained that his role was to act as the sales clerk after Yost had been taken care of. That confession was later introduced as evidence against him at trial. While Wilson remained in custody, officers searched Alverson's home. There they found the drop safe that had been stolen from the Quick Trip, along with the dolly used to move it, a bottle of Quick Trip glass cleaner, money tubes, and the surveillance videotape that Wilson had removed from the store. Together, these items provided strong physical evidence linking the men to the crime. The following day, February 27, 1995, Wilson's mother, Patricia Taylor, contacted the police and asked Officer Mackinson to come to her home. When officers arrived, they found several important pieces of evidence that had been left on the front porch. These included the black aluminum baseball bat used to beat Yost, a bloody Quick Trip jacket with Yost's name on it, Wilson's own Nike jacket that matched the one he had worn during the robbery, and the missing handcuff from the pair used to restrain Yost. This evidence proved to be crucial in connecting Wilson and his accomplices to the crime. The case eventually went to trial, where Wilson was tried jointly with his co-defendant, Darwin Brown. The court used a dual jury procedure, meaning 2 separate juries sat in the same courtroom. One jury considered Wilson's case, while the other considered Brown's. This arrangement ensured that evidence admissible against only one defendant would not unfairly influence the jury deciding the other's case. Wilson was represented by his own attorney throughout the proceedings. During the trial, prosecutors presented a strong case against Wilson. They introduced the surveillance video showing the robbery and portions of the attack, along with the audio recording that captured the sound of the baseball bat striking Yost and Yost pleading for mercy. They also presented DNA evidence linking Yost's blood to the bat and the clothing recovered during the investigation, as well as Wilson's confession. Taken together, the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury found Wilson guilty of first-degree murder and robbery with a dangerous weapon. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued that 3 aggravating circumstances justified the death penalty. They stated that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, that it had been committed to avoid arrest or prosecution, and that Wilson posed a continuing threat to society. The jury found all 3 aggravating circumstances to be true, recommended a sentence of death, and the judge imposed the death penalty. Wilson appealed both his conviction and his sentence to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. On direct appeal, his attorneys argued that errors had occurred during the trial. The court upheld his conviction for first-degree murder and his death sentence. However, it reversed his conviction for robbery with a dangerous weapon, ruling that because he had been convicted of felony murder, he could not also be convicted of the underlying robbery. That conviction was dismissed, but his murder conviction and death sentence remained in effect. Wilson continued challenging his conviction through the courts by filing a petition for habeas corpus relief in federal court. He argued that his trial attorney had provided ineffective assistance during the sentencing phase by failing to properly investigate his mental health and by not presenting all available mitigating evidence. The federal appeals court ruled that Wilson was entitled to an evidentiary hearing on this claim, sending the case back to a lower court so additional evidence regarding his mental health could be gathered. Even so, this process did not prevent his death sentence from being carried out while the legal proceedings continued. Wilson's 3 accomplices were also prosecuted. Darwin Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on January 22, 2009. Billy Don Alverson was likewise convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death, and he was executed on January 6, 2011. Richard Harjo, who was only 16 years old at the time of the crime, was not eligible for the death penalty under the law because of his age. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wilson also sought clemency from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, asking that his death sentence be reduced to life imprisonment. During the clemency hearing on December 16, 2013, he apologized to Richard Yost's family, saying that he had been young and foolish, and that he was a different person now. The board voted 4-1 to deny his request, and his plea for clemency was rejected. On January 9, 2014, Michael Lee Wilson was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. The execution began at 6 p.m. Before it started, Wilson gave brief final remarks. He said that he loved everybody and loved the world. He asked that his daughters be loved for him and said he would miss them always. The execution then began, and within about 20 seconds Wilson said that he felt his whole body burning. He was pronounced dead at 6:06 p.m. Wilson's family witnessed the execution. Throughout the procedure, his sister sang a hymn. His mother stood to take one final look at her son as the curtain closed, while his fiancée sobbed beside her. Richard Yost's family also witnessed the execution, including his widow, Angela Yost, and their 2 sons, who were now grown. Afterward, Yost's family released a statement saying that closure would come from no longer hearing about the case on the news or reading about it in the newspaper. They said their closure would come from no longer reliving Richard Yost's death, and instead remembering the good times they had shared with him. With the execution of the last of the 3 men sentenced to death for Yost's murder, the case had finally come to an end. Story 2. Dennis B. McGuire was born on February 10, 1960. His mother was Doris Newton, and his father was Gennis McGuire Sr. Dennis was the middle child. He had an older brother named Gennis Jr. and a younger sister named Mary Beth. Dennis's parents were very young when they had children. His mother Doris was only 15 years old when she married Gennis Sr., the family did not have much money. They often did not have enough food to eat. When Doris was pregnant with Dennis, she often went hungry because there was not enough food in the house. Her husband Gennis Sr. would hunt for squirrels and rabbits to feed the family. Sometimes he would steal food when hunting was not enough. Dennis was born without a doctor present. His grandmother helped with the birth instead of a medical professional. The umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck when he was born, which can be dangerous for a baby, but Dennis survived the birth. As a baby, Dennis did not get enough milk because his family could not afford to buy milk for him. Instead, they gave him sugar water to drink. Because of this lack of proper nutrition, Dennis was malnourished as a baby. His stomach became swollen and stuck out, which made him look bloated. Other children later made fun of him for appearing fat, but the real reason was that his body was not getting the proper food and nutrients it needed to grow normally. Dennis's parents divorced when he was only 2 years old. After the divorce, Dennis lived with his mother. His older brother Gennis Jr. went to live with their father, so the brothers did not see each other very often during childhood. Dennis's father could not read or write and had only finished 3rd grade. He often lost jobs because he would get into fights. Dennis's mother also came from a family that showed very little affection. Her parents rarely hugged her or showed her love. This pattern of emotional distance continued into her own parenting. After the divorce, Dennis's mother married several different men. She was married 6 times in total. Each new husband brought different problems into the home. Dennis had to live with a series of stepfathers, and many of them were violent or abusive. One stepfather was named Don Cons. Don Cons would poke Dennis hard in the forehead with his finger and call him stupid when Dennis could not do things like tie his shoes. Another stepfather was named Danny Rainey, who had earned a black belt in karate. Danny Rainey would beat Dennis with wooden spoons and belts. Another stepfather named Jerry Miller would yell at Dennis for small things like sitting on the carpet and flattening the carpet pile. Dennis's mother also beat him on several occasions, and his sister Mary Beth would hit him too. Dennis witnessed extreme violence in his home. He saw his stepfathers beat his mother many times. On one occasion, he saw his mother fire a gun at one of her husbands. Dennis was often the one who had to run to get help when his mother was being beaten. The abuse was not just physical, it was also verbal and mental. Dennis was constantly told he was stupid and worthless. Dennis also experienced sexual abuse as a child. When he was about 10 or 11 years old, an adult male rubbed against him in a sexual way during a bike ride. When he was 12 or 13, older males in the neighborhood forced him to perform oral sex and anal sex on them. His mother knew about some of this abuse, but did not take action to protect him. There was also inappropriate sexual behavior within his extended family. His uncles would grab him by his genitals and ask him if his penis was growing. They would also ask him to have anal sex with them. This kind of abuse and inappropriate behavior was common in Dennis's childhood, and it had a lasting negative effect on his development. Because his mother moved frequently, Dennis changed schools many times. He attended several different schools, and each time he had to start over with new teachers and new classmates. He struggled in school because he could not read or write well. He also had a speech problem because he was born tongue-tied, which made it difficult for him to speak clearly. By the time Dennis was in 8th grade, he was doing only 2nd grade level schoolwork. He often skipped school to avoid being beaten up by other children. There was racial tension at his schools, and he was repeatedly involved in fights. He dropped out of school after finishing 9th grade. He was 16 years old when he left school to enter the workforce. Dennis started using marijuana when he was only 9 years old. He continued using marijuana regularly throughout his teenage years and into adulthood. He was also exposed to alcohol from a very young age. His father and stepfathers drank heavily. When Dennis was a small child, his parents would take him to bars instead of getting a babysitter, and they would tie his stroller to the bar. As Dennis grew older, his father would buy alcohol for him, even though he was underage. His father was also addicted to Valium and pain pills, and this addiction lasted for many years. The drug and alcohol use was a normal part of life in Dennis's family. Despite all of these problems, Dennis did have some positive relationships. He was close to his older brother Dennis Jr., even though they lived apart for much of their childhood. When they were able to see each other, Dennis looked up to his brother and wanted to be like him. Dennis was also close to his mother in some ways. He was her protector when she was being beaten, and this created a special bond between them. However, his mother was often emotionally absent. She did not provide structure or guidance for Dennis. She allowed him to come and go as he pleased, and he would disappear for days at a time without anyone knowing where he was. His mother later admitted that she had very poor judgment when it came to choosing men. Dennis worked at various jobs after leaving school. He did not have a career or a steady job for a long period of time. In September 1980, when he was 20 years old, he was arrested in Frankfort, Kentucky for receiving stolen property. He was sentenced to 2 years of probation for that offense. In November 1988, when he was 28 years old, he was arrested in Eaton, Ohio for breaking and entering and theft. On January 24, 1989, he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison for these charges, but the sentence was suspended, meaning he was placed on probation instead of going to prison. This meant that in early 1989, Dennis was on probation and living in the community. Dennis married and had children. He had a daughter named Amber and a son named Dennis Jr. At the time of the events that would later occur, Dennis's marriage was already having problems. His brother later recalled that Dennis and his wife had already separated about a month before the murder took place. Dennis was trying to support his family, but he had a limited education and a criminal record, which made it difficult for him to find steady work. He sometimes did odd jobs for people like cleaning gutters to earn money. He continued to use marijuana and associate with people who used drugs. Throughout his life up to this point, Dennis had experienced poverty, neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and emotional trauma. He had grown up in a chaotic and unstable environment. He had no positive male role models. His father was violent and illiterate. His stepfathers were abusive. His mother was unable to provide a stable home. He had dropped out of school, struggled with drug and alcohol use, and had already been arrested for several crimes. He was a man with very limited education and job skills. He had a history of making poor decisions and associating with people who were also involved in criminal activity. He had never received any real help for the trauma he had experienced as a child. He was 29 years old in February 1989, and his life had been marked by hardship and dysfunction from the very beginning. He was living in the Preble County area of Ohio and trying to get by, but his life was not stable. He was on probation for his recent breaking and entering conviction, and he was trying to stay out of trouble. He was not a wealthy man, and he did not have a promising future ahead of him. His relationships with his family members were complicated, but he still cared about his children and his brother. He continued to live in the same community where he had grown up, surrounded by the same people and the same problems that had been part of his life since childhood. On February 11, 1989, a young woman named Joy Stewart was living in West Alexandria, Ohio. She was 22 years old. She had recently married her husband Kenny Stewart, who worked as a truck driver. Joy was also about 30 weeks pregnant with their first child. She was a friendly and trusting person who was excited about becoming a mother. That morning, Joy's husband Kenny left for work at about 7 a.m. and would not return until about 5 p.m. Joy had breakfast with her neighbors between 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning. After breakfast, she went to visit a woman named Juanita Deaton. Juanita Deaton was the mother of Joy's friend Chris Deaton. The Deatons lived next to each other in a duplex in West Alexandria. Dennis McGuire had been hired by Chris Deaton to clean ice out of the gutters on the Deaton house that day. Chris Deaton later said that McGuire started working on the gutters at about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock in the morning. McGuire was working on the gutters while Joy was visiting Juanita Deaton. Juanita Deaton later reported that she saw Joy talking to two unidentified men in a dark-colored car before Joy left. As Joy was leaving, she told Mrs. Deaton that she was going to catch a ride somewhere. Mrs. Deaton did not actually see Joy get into any car, and she was not sure if McGuire was one of the men in the dark-colored car. A few minutes after Joy left, Mrs. Deaton asked her son Chris whether McGuire had finished working on the gutters. Chris told her that McGuire had been paid and had already left the property. Later that afternoon, McGuire went to the house of his brother-in-law, Jerry Richardson. Jerry Richardson was 18 years old at the time. While McGuire and Richardson were in Richardson's garage, Joy Stewart arrived and walked into the garage. She asked if anyone had marijuana that she could buy or use. Richardson later testified that McGuire then offered to get some marijuana for Joy. McGuire and Joy left together in McGuire's car. This was the last time anyone saw Joy Stewart alive. What happened next was violent and deadly. McGuire drove Joy to a remote, wooded area near Bantus Creek in Preble County. At some point during this trip, McGuire wanted to have sex with Joy. She refused his advances. She was pregnant and married, and she did not want to have sex with him. Despite her refusal, McGuire forced himself on her. He raped her vaginally and also raped her anally. Because Joy was so heavily pregnant, it was difficult for McGuire to have vaginal sex with her, so he committed anal rape instead. Joy became very upset and hysterical after being raped. This made McGuire nervous. He was afraid that Joy would report him to the police. He knew that he was on probation for breaking and entering, and he was terrified of going back to prison for raping a pregnant woman. So he decided to kill her to make sure she could not tell anyone what he had done. McGuire attacked Joy with a knife. The knife had a single-edged blade. He stabbed her twice. The first stab wound was in the area above her left collarbone. This wound did not cause a serious injury, but the second stab wound was much more severe. McGuire cut her throat with the knife. The cut was 4.5 inches deep. It completely severed her carotid artery and jugular vein. These are the main blood vessels in the neck. Joy was still alive when he cut her throat, and she would have bled to death very quickly from this wound. The cut was so deep that it was clear McGuire intended to kill her and end her life in a decisive and violent manner. He also choked her before stabbing her, leaving abrasions on her neck. The pattern of her shirt was impressed into her skin from the choking. After he had killed her, McGuire wiped his bloody hands on her shirt, leaving a blood-wiped mark on her arm. He then left her body in the woods near Bantus Creek. She was not wearing her coat, and it was cold outside in the Ohio winter. The next day, February 12, 1989, two hikers were walking through the woods near Bantus Creek. They discovered Joy Stewart's body lying on the ground. The front of her shirt was completely saturated with blood. The hikers contacted authorities, and the body was taken to the Montgomery County Coroner's office for an autopsy. The autopsy confirmed that Joy had been stabbed twice, with the fatal wound being the deep cut to her throat. The coroner also found abrasions around her neck from choking. The coroner's office took swabs from Joy's vaginal, oral, and anal areas. They found a large amount of sperm on the anal swab and some sperm on the vaginal swab. They found no sperm on the oral swab. Joy's unborn child, who was about 30 weeks old, also died because of the attack. The baby died at the same time Joy died, likely in the woods where her body was left. After the murder, McGuire did not confess to what he had done. Instead, he began a series of lies and deceptions to try to avoid being caught. He decided to blame the murder on his 18-year-old brother-in-law, Jerry Richardson. McGuire knew that Richardson had been with him at the garage when Joy arrived, and he thought he could use Richardson as a scapegoat. McGuire started telling people that Richardson had been the one who killed Joy. He gave detailed accounts of how Richardson had allegedly committed the murder. These details were significant because they matched the actual crime scene, including the fact that Joy had been stabbed twice in the neck and had been anally sodomized. These facts had not been released to the public, so only the killer would know them. McGuire also led investigators to a knife that he claimed was the murder weapon. He told them the knife was hidden behind a beam in a hayloft on a farm where he and Richardson had occasionally worked. McGuire claimed that Richardson had been driving his mother's blue Ford Escort on the day of the murder. However, this claim was false. Richardson's mother later proved that she had traded that car in a year before the murder, and she had driven her car to work on the day of the murder, so Richardson could not have been driving it. McGuire also told his childhood friend Sean Baird that he knew about a murder that had happened in Preble County in February. When Baird asked who did it, McGuire admitted that he and Jerry Richardson had done it together. McGuire then said that he was going to blame the entire crime on Richardson. This showed that McGuire was planning to use Richardson to take the blame for the murder. While in jail on unrelated charges, McGuire talked to other inmates about the murder. One inmate, Jack Stapleton, overheard McGuire telling another inmate about the crime. McGuire was describing how the murder happened. While telling the story, McGuire accidentally slipped up and said I instead of he. He was describing how the victim was stabbed, and he said, I stabbed her like this. Hit a bone. It didn't kill her, so I stabbed her again. Then he corrected himself and said he to try to make it sound like Richardson was the killer. But Stapleton heard the mistake and understood that McGuire was actually describing his own actions. Another inmate, Willie Reeves, later testified that McGuire gave him a different version of the crime. McGuire told Reeves that while he was cleaning gutters, Joy had shown up and asked if McGuire had any marijuana. McGuire offered to share some with her, and they left in his car. McGuire then told Reeves that he asked Joy if she wanted to have sex, and she refused. McGuire told Reeves that he did it anyway. He explained that because Joy was so pregnant, it was hard to have vaginal sex, so he anally sodomized her instead. Joy became hysterical, and that made McGuire nervous. McGuire said he killed her because he was afraid of going to jail for raping a pregnant woman. This confession to Reeves was clear and direct. McGuire did not mention Richardson as an accomplice in this version. He took full responsibility for the rape and murder. McGuire also tried to arrange for another inmate, Stephen Kassler, to take the blame for the murder. Kassler was known for falsely confessing to crimes he did not commit. McGuire attempted to conspire with Kassler so that Kassler would confess to Joy Stewart's murder and take the blame away from McGuire. This plan failed when prison officials intercepted a letter sent from Kassler to McGuire. Throughout all of these attempts to avoid responsibility, McGuire was using lies and tricks. He gave detailed information to the police that only the killer would know, but he blamed Richardson. He told friends and fellow inmates different versions of the story. Sometimes he admitted that he was involved, sometimes he blamed others, and sometimes he accidentally revealed his own guilt. His goal was always the same: to avoid being held accountable for raping and killing Joy Stewart and her unborn child. But even as he lied, he kept revealing more and more details that pointed directly to him as the person who had committed these crimes. After the murder, the police investigation continued for many months. Investigator David Lintloff from the Preble County Prosecutor's Office was assigned to the case. He gathered evidence and interviewed witnesses, but for a long time, there was no clear suspect. The case remained unsolved. Then, in December 1989, McGuire was in jail on an unrelated charge. He had been arrested for an unrelated crime involving the knife-point abduction of a 15-year-old girl named Chikara Russell. While in jail, McGuire told a corrections officer that he wanted to talk to investigator Lintloff about the Joy Stewart murder. This was the beginning of his attempt to blame Richardson, as described in Part 2. But what McGuire did not know was that the police were collecting scientific evidence that would later prove his guilt beyond any doubt. In June 1992, the Montgomery County Coroner's Office sent the vaginal, anal, and oral swabs from Joy's body to a private laboratory called Forensic Science Associates. The lab performed DNA testing using a technique called PCR. This technique could analyze very small amounts of genetic material. The lab compared DNA from the swabs with blood samples taken from Dennis McGuire, Jerry Richardson, Joy Stewart, and Joy's husband Kenny Stewart. The results were clear. The sperm found on Joy's body contained DNA that matched McGuire's DNA type. McGuire's DNA type was DQ-alpha-3-4. Jerry Richardson and Kenny Stewart both had a different type, DQ-alpha-1.12. The lab found that Richardson and Kenny Stewart could only be sources of sperm if there were two different men, meaning multiple assailants. But there was no evidence of a second attacker. McGuire was the only person who could not be eliminated as the source of the sperm. The DNA evidence was strong. The sperm DNA had characteristics that appear in about 1 in every 119 white males. This meant that McGuire was very likely the person who had raped Joy. Based on the DNA evidence and the other evidence gathered, McGuire was indicted on December 22, 1993. The charges against him included 1 count of aggravated murder with a specification for rape, 2 counts of rape, vaginal and anal, and 1 count of kidnapping. The trial began in late 1994. The prosecution presented a strong case. They showed that McGuire had detailed knowledge of the crime that only the killer would know. They presented testimony from the jailhouse informants who had heard McGuire confess or slip up. They presented the DNA evidence that matched McGuire. The defense tried to argue that Jerry Richardson or Kenny Stewart could have been the source of the sperm, but the DNA evidence did not support that. Kenny Stewart had been at work on the day of the murder, and Jerry Richardson did not have access to the car that McGuire claimed he had used. On December 8, 1994, the jury returned a guilty verdict. McGuire was found guilty of aggravated murder, anal rape, and kidnapping. The jury then moved to the sentencing phase, where they had to decide whether McGuire should receive the death penalty or life in prison. During the sentencing phase, McGuire's attorneys presented evidence about his difficult childhood. They called his mother, his half-sister, and a psychologist to testify. They described his turbulent upbringing, his poverty, his abuse, and his limited education. However, the jury also heard that McGuire had previously abducted a 15-year-old girl at knife point just 10 months after killing Joy. This showed a pattern of violent behavior toward vulnerable women. The jury deliberated for a long time. At one point, they sent a note to the judge saying they were voting 11-1 on a possible sentence. Eventually, the jury recommended the death penalty. On December 23, 1994, the trial judge sentenced Dennis McGuire to death for aggravated murder. He was also sentenced to 10 to 25 years in prison for the rape conviction. McGuire appealed his conviction and sentence. The case went to the Ohio Supreme Court. On December 10, 1997, the Ohio Supreme Court affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence. The court independently reviewed all the evidence and weighed the aggravating circumstances against the mitigating factors. The court concluded that the rape and murder of a pregnant woman was so serious that the death sentence was appropriate and proportionate to other similar cases. McGuire then filed a federal habeas corpus petition, which is a legal challenge to the state court decision. The federal district court denied relief, and in 2010, the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals also denied relief. The courts consistently found that the evidence was sufficient and that McGuire had received a fair trial. For many years, McGuire continued to maintain his innocence. He blamed Richardson, he made up stories, and he tried to get other people to take the blame. But as the date of his execution approached, he finally changed his story. 2 days before his clemency hearing in December 2013, McGuire wrote a letter to Governor John Kasich. In that letter, McGuire admitted for the first time that he had killed Joy Stewart. However, he claimed that he and Joy had been having an extramarital affair, and that he killed her during a heated argument after she demanded that he leave his wife and children. He said he lost control and killed her. This claim of an affair was not supported by any evidence. Joy's family strongly denied it, and no investigation had ever uncovered any relationship between McGuire and Joy. They barely knew each other. McGuire's brother also had no knowledge of any affair. The letter appeared to be another attempt to soften the crime and make it seem less brutal. The Ohio Parole Board held a clemency hearing on December 12, 2013. McGuire's attorneys argued that his trial lawyers had failed to present all the evidence of his traumatic childhood, which they believed could have led the jury to spare his life. They presented new testimony about the abuse McGuire had suffered. The prosecution argued that McGuire's childhood did not excuse his crime. They pointed out that McGuire had spent decades lying and trying to frame other people. They also noted that he had committed another violent crime against a 15-year-old girl less than a year after the murder. Joy's sister Carol Avery spoke at the hearing. She described her sister as a trusting and loving person. She said her family had forgiven McGuire, but they believed he should pay with his life for what he did. The parole board voted 11-0 against recommending clemency. Governor Kasich accepted their recommendation and denied clemency. On January 16, 2014, Dennis McGuire was executed at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. The execution was scheduled for 10 a.m., but the process began at 10:27 a.m. Ohio had recently changed its execution method because the previous drug, pentobarbital, was no longer available. They used a new two-drug combination, midazolam, which is a sedative, and hydromorphone, which is a morphine derivative. This was the first time this combination had ever been used in an execution in the United States. At 10:29 a.m., McGuire's eyes rolled back as if he were going to sleep. But then, around 10:35 a.m., he began to struggle. He gasped loudly for air and made snorting and choking sounds. His chest heaved, and his left fist clenched. These sounds lasted for at least 10 minutes. His adult children, Amber and Dennis Jr., were watching through a window. They cried and held each other. They later said it was horrifying to watch. Finally, McGuire became still. He was pronounced dead at 10:53 a.m. The execution had taken 26 minutes, which was the longest execution in Ohio since the state resumed capital punishment in 1999. Before his execution, McGuire had a last meal. He ate roast beef, fried chicken, fried potatoes with onions, potato salad, a toasted onion bagel with cream cheese, butter pecan ice cream, and Coca-Cola. He skipped breakfast on the morning of his execution. His final words were spoken to the witnesses. He thanked Joy Stewart's family for a letter he said they had sent him, referring to kind words that meant a lot to him. He also told his children, "I'm going to heaven. I'll see you there when you get there." Joy's family issued a statement after the execution. They said that they remembered the terror and pain Joy suffered as she was forced from the car, raped, choked, and stabbed. They noted that McGuire was being treated far more humanely than he had treated Joy. They also said that the controversy about the drugs and whether McGuire might suffer did not move them, because they knew that Joy had suffered greatly. After the execution, McGuire's children announced that they would file a lawsuit against the state of Ohio. They claimed that the execution had been cruel and unusual punishment because McGuire had struggled and gasped for so long. They said that no one should have to go through that, regardless of the crimes committed. The execution also drew criticism from death penalty opponents, who called it a failed experiment and demanded a moratorium on executions in Ohio. They argued that the untried drug combination had caused unnecessary suffering. However, the execution had already been carried out, and McGuire was dead. The legal challenges to the execution method continued in other cases, but they could not change what had happened to Dennis McGuire. He was the first person executed in Ohio in 2014, and he was the 53rd person executed in Ohio since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The story of Dennis McGuire ended on that day in January 2014, but the story of Joy Stewart and her unborn child had ended long before, in the woods near Bantus Creek, where a young pregnant woman lost her life because one man chose violence, rape, and murder over accepting the consequences of his actions. Story 3. Edgar Arias Tamayo was born on July 22, 1967, in Mexico, where he spent his early years. His parents raised him in their home country. Although the family did not have a lot of money, they made sure that Tamayo had enough food to eat and a place to sleep. His parents later said that he was not a troublesome child. When he was young, he did not get into fights or create problems at school. Tamayo attended school in Mexico, although it is not known exactly how many years of education he completed. He did not attend college or receive any advanced education. He grew up like many other children in his area and did not have any major encounters with the law during his childhood or teenage years. According to his parents, he was a normal boy who stayed away from serious trouble. As Tamayo became an adult, he made the decision to leave Mexico and move to the United States. He crossed the border without the proper legal documents, making him an undocumented immigrant. He was not a citizen of the United States, and he did not have permission to live or work there. However, he entered the country in search of employment and a different life. Tamayo first settled in California, where he found work as a laborer. This type of work involved physical tasks such as lifting, carrying, building, or cleaning. He did not have a special trade or a professional license, so he earned money by working with his hands. For a period of time, he lived a quiet life and continued working. That changed in 1991, when Tamayo committed a robbery in California. A robbery is a crime in which a person takes something from another person by using force or the threat of force. Police arrested him, and he was later found guilty of the crime in court. As a result, he was sentenced to prison. Tamayo spent 3 years incarcerated in a California prison from 1991 until 1993. While in prison, Tamayo completed his full sentence for the robbery. In 1993, he was released on parole. Parole meant that he was allowed to leave prison, but he was required to follow certain rules and report to a parole officer. After his release, Tamayo did not remain in California. Instead, he traveled to Texas and moved to Houston, a large city in the state. He arrived there sometime in late 1993 or early 1994. At that time, he was still an illegal immigrant and had no legal status in the country. He also had a criminal record because of his robbery conviction in California. In Houston, Tamayo found work again as a laborer. He lived a simple life, working and staying in the area. He did not have any known close friends or a steady girlfriend during that period. For the most part, he kept to himself. On January 31st, 1994, Tamayo was 26 years old. He was living in Houston and working odd jobs. He had a wife, although the details of their marriage are not fully recorded. What is known is that on that day, his life would take a very different turn. But that part of the story comes later. That day came on January 31st, 1994. It was early in the morning, at around 2:21 a.m., when Tamayo was inside a nightclub called the Topaz Night Club. The club was located in southwest Houston on Chimney Rock Road. He was not alone. He was with another man named Jesus Zarco Mendoza. While inside the nightclub, Tamayo and Mendoza robbed a patron. They took the man's watch and necklace. The victim was frightened by what happened, but he was not physically injured. After the robbery, the victim ran out of the club looking for help. Outside, he saw a police car and flagged it down. The officer driving the vehicle was Guy Patrick Gaddis. Officer Gaddis was 24 years old and had been a police officer for 2 years. He was on duty that night. When the victim explained what had happened, Officer Gaddis drove to the nightclub parking lot to search for the suspects. There, he found Tamayo and Mendoza. He ordered both men to stand against a wall and searched them. During the search, he found the robbery victim's watch on Tamayo. This was clear evidence that Tamayo had been involved in the robbery. Officer Gaddis then placed both men under arrest. He handcuffed them with their hands behind their backs and put them in the back seat of his patrol car. Tamayo was placed in the left rear seat, directly behind the driver's seat, while Mendoza was placed in the right rear seat. A clear plexiglass barrier separated the front seat from the back seat. The barrier was designed to protect the officer from anyone being transported in the rear of the vehicle. Officer Gaddis got into the driver's seat and began driving toward the jail. However, he did not go directly there. Instead, he stopped at a convenience store to make a phone call. He needed to speak with the district attorney's office about the charges he would file against Tamayo and Mendoza. Officer Gaddis left the patrol car and walked to a payphone. While he was outside, Tamayo and Mendoza were alone in the back seat. During that time, Tamayo told Mendoza that he had a gun hidden in his waistband. He had managed to keep the weapon hidden even when Officer Gaddis searched him, and the officer had not found it. Although Tamayo was handcuffed, he was still able to move his hands behind his back. He reached into his waistband and pulled out the gun. The weapon was a Bursa .380 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Tamayo had purchased the gun several days before the robbery and had carried it with him that night. Officer Gaddis finished his phone call and returned to the patrol car. He started driving again, heading south on Chimney Rock Road. While the vehicle was moving, Tamayo turned his body around in the back seat so that he was facing the rear of the car. He placed the gun directly against the plexiglass divider and fired 6 times. The bullets passed through the plexiglass and struck Officer Gaddis in the back of the head. 3 of the bullets hit him, striking the head and neck area. Officer Gaddis immediately lost control of the patrol car. The vehicle veered off the road, crossed through a yard, and crashed into the front of a house. The impact was severe, damaging both the front of the house and the police car. The people inside the house were awakened by the sound of the crash. When they came outside, they saw the damaged police car and found Officer Gaddis slumped over the steering wheel. He was not moving. They also saw Mendoza in the back seat. He was bleeding from the head and appeared to be unconscious. They called for help, and Bel Air police officers arrived quickly. Paramedics also arrived at the scene and attempted to revive Officer Gaddis. However, he had no pulse and was not breathing. He was transported to the hospital by helicopter, but doctors pronounced him dead at 4:31 a.m. He had died from his gunshot wounds. By the time people came outside after the crash, Tamayo was no longer inside the vehicle. During the collision, he had been injured but was not knocked unconscious. He used his feet to kick out the broken glass from the left rear window, then crawled out of the patrol car and ran away. Tamayo was still wearing the handcuffs. He ran north on Chimney Rock Road while still carrying the robbery victim's necklace and watch. A Houston police officer named O.R. Warren was driving south on Chimney Rock Road when he saw a man running with his hands cuffed behind his back. The sight was unusual, and Officer Warren realized that the man was connected to the crashed police car. He chased Tamayo and captured him several blocks away from the crash scene. The handcuffs Tamayo was wearing still had Officer Gaddis's employee number on them. This proved that they were the same handcuffs that had been placed on him by Officer Gaddis. Later that day, investigators spoke with Tamayo and asked him what had happened. He gave 2 written statements. In those statements, he admitted that he had the gun inside the police car. He admitted that he shot Officer Gaddis, and he admitted that he knew Gaddis was a police officer. When investigators asked Tamayo why he had done it, he gave a reason. He said he was angry with Officer Gaddis because Gaddis would not allow him to leave his car keys with his wife before he was taken to jail. Tamayo wanted his wife to have the keys, but Gaddis refused. According to Tamayo, that made him angry, and he decided to shoot the officer. The gun was later recovered from the back of the police car. Investigators found 6 spent bullet casings in the rear area of the vehicle, along with the pistol. The evidence showed that Tamayo was the only person who fired the weapon. Mendoza did not shoot anyone. Instead, Mendoza was a witness to what happened. Mendoza told investigators that Tamayo had talked about shooting his way out while they were waiting inside the car. Police also learned that Tamayo had purchased the gun several days before the robbery. This showed that he had planned to carry a weapon with him that night. At the time of the shooting, some police officers noticed that the search of Tamayo had not been complete. They realized that the gun had been missed during the pat-down search. They noted this as a problem, but they did not take any immediate action against anyone for that mistake. Their attention remained focused on the crime that had just occurred. The victim of the original robbery was also interviewed by investigators. He confirmed that his watch and necklace had been taken. After Tamayo was arrested several blocks from the crash site, he was taken into custody. He was still wearing the handcuffs that had Officer Gaddis's employee number on them, and he was still carrying the robbery victim's watch and necklace. These items were collected as evidence by police. Investigators now had clear physical proof connecting him to both the robbery and the murder. The investigation was handled by the Houston Police Department's Homicide Division. However, there was a question about which police department had legal authority over the case because the crash occurred in the city of Bel Air, not Houston. The Bel Air police had jurisdiction over that location. However, Houston homicide lieutenants spoke with the Bel Air police chief and offered to take full responsibility for the investigation. The chief agreed. This decision allowed one agency to handle the entire case, making the investigation simpler and more organized. The lead investigators were Sergeants Jerry Novak and Larry Weber. They worked under the supervision of Captain Bill Edison and Lieutenant Nelson Zock. The investigators divided the responsibilities among different officers. One sergeant was assigned to take care of Tamayo and ensure that his legal rights were protected. Another sergeant was responsible for interviewing Mendoza, who was now considered a witness. 2 investigators from the Chicano squad were also brought in because Tamayo and Mendoza spoke Spanish. These investigators were able to conduct interviews in their own language to prevent misunderstandings. Police collected evidence from the patrol car. They recovered the Bursa .380 pistol from the back seat and found 6 spent bullet casings. Investigators also counted 5 bullet holes in the plexiglass divider. They photographed the patrol car and the crash scene. They interviewed the people who lived in the house that had been hit by the vehicle. Those residents confirmed that they heard the crash and came outside to find Officer Gaddis slumped over the steering wheel. The paramedics who attempted to save Officer Gaddis also provided statements about what they witnessed. Tamayo gave 2 written statements to police. In those statements, he admitted that he had the gun, that he shot the officer, and that he knew the officer was a police officer. These statements were documented and later used as evidence during the case. Police also investigated his background and discovered that he had previously served time in California for robbery. That prior conviction was recorded in his file. On September 27, 1994, a grand jury in Harris County formally charged Tamayo with capital murder. A capital murder charge means that the crime involved certain serious circumstances, such as the killing of a police officer who was performing official duties. The case went to trial in October 1994. The trial was held in the 209th Judicial District Court in Harris County. During the trial, the jury heard all of the evidence related to the case. They heard about the robbery, the shooting of Officer Gaddis, the crash, and Tamayo's escape. They also heard Tamayo's own statements admitting what he had done. Mendoza testified about what Tamayo said while they were sitting in the back seat of the patrol car. On October 27, 1994, the jury found Tamayo guilty of capital murder. The trial then moved into the punishment phase. During this stage, prosecutors presented evidence about Tamayo's past. They told the jury about his robbery conviction in California and presented evidence of other incidents. They said Tamayo had threatened to harm several people on different occasions. They also said he had fired a gun in a mobile home park in the direction of other homes, and that he had been seen chasing a man while holding a gun. Prosecutors presented these incidents to show that Tamayo was a dangerous person. Tamayo's lawyers presented their own evidence in an effort to spare his life. They called 3 bailiffs who worked at the courthouse. These bailiffs testified that Tamayo had been respectful toward them and had never been violent while in their care. His lawyers also called 2 former co-workers who said they had worked with Tamayo and had never experienced any problems with him. They also called Tamayo's parents. His parents testified that he had not been in trouble as a child and that he had always had enough food and shelter. They told the jury they were sorry for the pain their son had caused Officer Gaddis's family, and they asked the jury to spare Tamayo's life. The prosecution then called a 4th bailiff, who gave a different account. This bailiff testified that Tamayo had been aggressive and uncooperative. The jury considered all of this information before making their decision. On November 1, 1994, the jury decided on Tamayo's punishment. They sentenced him to death. After receiving the death sentence, Tamayo began a long series of appeals. His first appeal was made to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. That court reviewed the case and upheld his conviction and death sentence on December 11, 1996. In 1998, Tamayo filed his first state habeas corpus application. A habeas corpus application is a legal request asking a court to review whether a person is being held in prison lawfully. In this application, Tamayo claimed that his lawyers had not provided effective assistance. He argued that they failed to properly investigate evidence that he had brain damage. The state court denied this request in June 2003. In September 2003, Tamayo filed a federal habeas corpus petition in a United States District Court. He raised the same claims about his lawyers and later added new claims. One of those claims involved the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. This is an international treaty stating that when a foreign citizen is arrested, police should inform that person that they have the right to contact their country's consulate for assistance. Tamayo claimed that he had never been informed of this right. Another claim was that he had a mental impairment and should not be executed, based on a U.S. Supreme Court decision called Atkins v. Virginia. The Federal District Court denied all of these claims on March 25, 2011. Tamayo appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, but that court denied his appeal on December 21, 2011. He then asked the U.S. Supreme Court to review his case. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case on November 13, 2012. During these years, Tamayo's case also received international attention. The Mexican government argued that his consular rights had been violated. In 2004, the International Court of Justice in the Netherlands ruled that Tamayo and other Mexican nationals had not been properly informed of their rights. The U.S. government, under President George W. Bush, asked Texas to review Tamayo's case to determine whether the violation affected the outcome of his trial. However, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that it was not required to follow the International Court's decision. The U.S. Supreme Court later agreed with Texas, stating that Congress would need to pass a law to make that international ruling binding in U.S. courts. Congress never passed such a law. On September 17, 2013, a Texas judge signed a death warrant, setting an execution date of January 22, 2014. In the weeks before the scheduled execution, Tamayo's lawyers filed additional appeals. They also asked the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for clemency. The board rejected his request on January 21, 2014. They argued that Tamayo was mentally impaired and that the consular rights violation was serious. The U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, sent a letter asking Texas to delay the execution. He said the case could affect how American citizens were treated in other countries. The Mexican government also asked Texas officials to stop the execution. Governor Rick Perry and Attorney General Greg Abbott did not grant any stays. They stated that Tamayo had received a fair trial under Texas law. On January 22, 2014, the day of the execution, the U.S. Supreme Court and lower federal courts reviewed final appeals. The execution was delayed by about 3 hours while those appeals were considered. All of the appeals were denied. That evening, Tamayo was taken to the death chamber at the Huntsville Unit Prison in Texas. He was asked if he wanted to make a final statement. He mumbled the word "no" and shook his head. He did not say anything else. He also chose not to have any witnesses present on his behalf. The lethal injection was then administered. The drug used was pentobarbital. Tamayo took a few breaths, then made one slightly audible snore, and afterward all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead at 9:32 p.m. Central Daylight Time. He was 46 years old. Officer Gaddis's mother and 2 brothers were among the witnesses who watched the execution through a window. Afterward, they said they felt some sense of closure. They also said they believed the execution was not about politics, but about justice for their family member. Tamayo did not look at them before he died. Once he was pronounced dead, the execution process was complete. Officer Guy Patrick Gaddis died on January 31, 1994, at the age of 24. He left behind a pregnant wife. His family continued to remember him and attend the legal proceedings throughout the years. Tamayo spent approximately 20 years on death row before his execution. His appeals had been exhausted, and the death sentence was carried out as ordered by the court. The case is now closed. Story 4. Thomas Knight was born on February 4, 1951. He was born in the state of Florida. He was the second oldest child in a very large family. He had 8 brothers and sisters. The family lived in a city called Fort Pierce, which is in Florida. Thomas's childhood was not a happy one. His family was extremely poor. They often did not have enough food to eat. They also did not have enough clothes to wear. The main reason for their poverty was Thomas's father. His father was an alcoholic, which means he drank too much alcohol. Because of his drinking, the father stopped providing for the family. This happened in the year 1960, when Thomas was 9 years old. The situation at home was also very violent. Thomas's father was an abusive man. He would beat Thomas and his siblings often. The beatings were brutal and happened regularly. One very serious event occurred in June of 1960. Thomas's father raped his older sister, whose name was Mary, and Thomas was only 9 years old at the time. He either saw the attack happen and tried to stop it, or his sister told him about it right after it happened. This was a very traumatic event for the entire family. Thomas started getting into trouble with the law when he was very young. He was first arrested at the age of 9. The charge was theft. A few months after that first arrest, he was arrested again for another theft. Because of this second arrest, he was sent to a state-run facility called the Florida School for Boys. He was the youngest child ever sent to that school. Being sent there did not stop his troubles. He continued to commit crimes. When he was 15 years old, he was sent to state prison. This was for a burglary conviction. When Thomas was 19 years old, his life took another difficult turn. He was sent to a mental hospital called the Northeast Florida State Hospital. He was admitted there because of his mental state and his behavior. The doctors who examined him gave him several diagnoses. They said he had drug and poison intoxication, which means he was affected by drugs and poisons. They also noted he was drinking too much alcohol. They also diagnosed him with a paranoid personality disorder. This means he had a mental condition where he was overly suspicious and distrustful of others. For a time after that, Thomas lived his life in and out of institutions. Eventually, he became an adult and needed to work. He moved to Miami, Florida. There, he found a job at a company that made paper bags. The owner of the company was a man named Sidney Gans. Thomas started working for Mr. Gans. He had only been working at the paper bag company for a short period of time. 10 days after he started, Thomas Knight was still a new employee. He was going to work each day. He was trying to earn money and keep his job, even though his past was full of struggles and problems. He had no idea that his life was about to change forever, and that his actions would soon affect many other people. Thomas Knight went to work at the paper bag company on the morning of July 17, 1974. He was a new employee. He had only been working for Sidney Gans for 10 days. That morning, Mr. Gans arrived at his business. He parked his Mercedes-Benz car in his designated parking space. As Mr. Gans began to get out of his car, Thomas Knight approached him. Knight was carrying an automatic rifle. He pointed the rifle at Mr. Gans and ordered him to get back into the car. Mr. Gans did not resist. He got back into the driver's seat of his car. Knight then got into the back seat of the car. He told Mr. Gans to drive home. Knight wanted Mr. Gans to pick up his wife. Mr. Gans drove to his house. When they arrived, Mrs. Lillian Gans got into the car. She sat in the front passenger seat. Knight then told Mr. Gans to drive to a bank. He demanded $50,000 in cash. Mr. Gans obeyed and drove to a bank in downtown Miami. When they arrived at the bank, Knight told Mr. Gans to go inside and get the money. Mr. Gans walked into the bank. He spoke to the bank president. He told the bank president that a man was holding him and his wife hostage. The bank president understood the danger. He called the police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is also known as the FBI. The police and the FBI quickly responded. They began to prepare for a surveillance operation. Mr. Gans then took the $50,000 in cash. He put the money in a paper bag. He walked back outside to his car. He got back into the car with his wife. The bank had given Mr. Gans marked bills. This meant the money could be identified later if it was found. Knight then ordered Mrs. Gans to drive the car. He wanted her to take an evasive route. This meant she had to drive in a way that would make it hard for anyone to follow them. Mrs. Gans drove south toward a rural area of Miami-Dade County. Police officers were following the car. They were in unmarked cars. They were dressed in street clothes so they would not be noticed. A helicopter and a small airplane also joined the surveillance. These aircraft followed the car from the sky. The officers in the cars and the pilots in the aircraft did not want Knight to see them. They remained hidden and did not use sirens or lights. The police officers followed the Mercedes for some time. They were able to keep the car in sight for about an hour. During this time, the car traveled about 20 miles. Then, something went wrong. The officers lost sight of the car. They could not see it for about 4 or 5 minutes. During that short period of time, Knight committed the murders. He shot Sidney and Lillian Gans. He fired the shots from the back seat of the car. The bullets went through their necks. Both victims died almost instantly from their wounds. Lillian was shot behind the steering wheel. She was still in the driver's seat. Sidney was dragged from the car after he was shot. His body was found about 25 feet away from the vehicle. After the shootings, Knight ran from the car. He ran toward a heavily wooded area. He had the automatic rifle in his hands. The police soon found the Mercedes. The front passenger door was open. The right rear passenger door was open. The trunk was also open. The police found the body of Lillian behind the steering wheel. They found the body of Sidney lying on the ground nearby. The police then began a search of the wooded area. About 4 hours later, they found Knight. He was hiding in a weeded area. He had tried to bury himself in the mud and the weeds. The police noticed bloodstains on his pants. They found the automatic rifle buried in the dirt underneath him. They also found the paper bag containing the $50,000. It was buried with the rifle. Knight was arrested at that moment. While Knight was waiting for his trial to begin, another event occurred. In September 1974, he escaped from the Dade County Jail. He escaped with 10 other inmates. This was a large jailbreak. After his escape, Knight became a wanted fugitive. The FBI placed him on its top 10 most wanted list. This meant he was considered one of the most dangerous criminals in the country. A nationwide manhunt began to find him. During the time he was on the run, Knight committed another crime. This happened in October 1974. He and another man went to a liquor store in Cordele, Georgia. Cordele is in Crisp County, Georgia. They asked the clerk for a bottle. When the clerk turned to get the bottle, they demanded money. They also demanded the wallets of both clerks. Then they started shooting. One of the clerks, named William Culpepper, was shot 3 times. He died from his wounds. Another clerk, named A.V. Norton, was shot twice. He survived the attack. The 2 men took $641 and fled the store. Knight was never tried for this crime in Georgia. The authorities in Florida had already sentenced him to death for the murders of the Gans couple. The FBI finally caught up with Knight on New Year's Eve, December 31st, 1974. They arrested him in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. When he was arrested, he was carrying a sawed-off shotgun, a .38 caliber revolver, and a 9mm automatic pistol. All 3 weapons had been stolen from a city called Titusville, Florida. Knight was taken back to jail. He was put back in custody. Knight went to trial for the murders of Sidney and Lillian Gans. The trial took place in Dade County, Florida. A jury found him guilty of first-degree murder on both counts. In April 1975, the judge sentenced him to death for both murders. He was sent to death row. He was held at the Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. This was a maximum security prison. Knight remained on death row for several years. During this time, he had many appeals. These are legal requests to have a court review a decision. His lawyers argued that he should not be executed. They argued about many legal points. While these appeals were happening, he was still in prison. In 1980, Knight committed another murder. This happened on October 12, 1980. At that time, Knight was in his cell on death row. A corrections officer named Richard Burke was working that day. Officer Burke was assigned to escort death row inmates to the showers. He had only been working at the prison for 4 months. Before the attack, there was another incident. A guard told Knight that he could see a visitor, but the guard said Knight had to shave his beard first. This was a prison regulation. Knight refused to shave. Because of his refusal, the visit was denied. 2 guards heard Knight make a comment. They heard him say, "Well, it looks like I will have to start sticking people." This was a direct threat. Later that day, Officer Burke came to Knight's cell. He unlocked the cell door. He was there to escort Knight to the shower. Knight then attacked Officer Burke. He was holding a weapon. The weapon was a sharpened spoon. He had sharpened the spoon to make it into a knife. Knight stabbed Officer Burke with the sharpened spoon many times. He caused more than a dozen wounds. One of these wounds was a stab wound to the heart. This wound was fatal. Officer Burke died from his injuries. Knight stopped the attack when other guards came to help. He dropped the weapon into a trash box. Knight was charged with the murder of Officer Richard Burke. He went to trial for this crime. In January 1983, he was convicted again. He was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to death for this murder as well. Now, Knight had 3 death sentences. He had been convicted of killing Sidney Gans, Lillian Gans, and Officer Richard Burke. He remained on death row, waiting for his sentences to be carried out. The investigation into the murders of Sidney and Lillian Gans began immediately after their bodies were found on July 17, 1974. The police and the FBI had already been involved because Mr. Gans had alerted the bank president. When the officers found the car and the bodies, they began to gather evidence. They found the automatic rifle and the money buried near Knight. They found bloodstains on his pants. They also had eyewitnesses who had seen Knight in the car with the victims. The evidence against him was very strong. The case was solved quickly because Knight was arrested at the scene. He was found hiding in the woods with the murder weapon and the stolen money. There was no question that he was the person who had committed the crimes. The police also investigated the murder of Officer Richard Burke. This happened inside the prison in 1980. Other guards witnessed the attack. They saw Knight stab Officer Burke with a sharpened spoon. They heard Officer Burke screaming for help. They also heard Knight make the threat earlier that day about needing to start sticking people. The weapon was found in a trash box near the scene. The evidence was clear. Knight was identified as the attacker. The investigation did not take a long time because there were multiple witnesses who saw the crime happen. The legal process for Knight was very long. It lasted for almost 40 years. Knight was first sentenced to death in 1975 for the murders of the Gans couple. He was sentenced to death again in 1983 for the murder of Officer Burke. Over the following decades, Knight and his lawyers filed many appeals. These were requests for higher courts to review his case. The appeals went to the Florida Supreme Court, the federal district courts, the federal appeals courts, and even the United States Supreme Court. In 1988, a federal appeals court made a decision about the Gans case. The court said that Knight should get a new sentencing hearing. This was because of legal errors during the original sentencing. The court said the judge and the lawyers had made comments that were not allowed. These comments suggested that the jury could only consider certain types of evidence. The law said the jury should be able to consider all types of evidence that might help Knight. So the court ordered a new penalty phase. This meant a new jury would decide if Knight should get the death penalty or life in prison. The new sentencing hearing took place in 1996. It happened in a Dade County courtroom. The state and the defense presented their evidence again. The jury heard about the murders. They also heard about Knight's difficult childhood and his mental health problems. After hearing all the evidence, the jury voted. They recommended the death penalty by a vote of 9-3. The judge accepted this recommendation. He sentenced Knight to death again for the murders of Sidney and Lillian Gans. Knight's lawyers continued to appeal this new sentence. There were many more appeals over the years. The lawyers argued about many different issues. They argued about whether Knight had a right to cross-examine certain witnesses. They argued about whether the judge had used the right legal rules. They argued about whether the death penalty was the correct punishment. The courts considered all these arguments. Most of the appeals were denied. The courts kept finding that Knight's convictions and sentences were correct. One major appeal was filed in a federal district court in Miami. This appeal took 6 years to decide. In November 2012, a federal judge made a surprising decision. The judge reversed Knight's death sentence for the Gans murders. The judge ordered a new sentencing hearing, or said Knight should get life in prison. The state of Florida appealed this decision. The Federal Appeals Court in Atlanta heard the case. In September 2013, the appeals court reversed the lower court's decision. The appeals court reinstated the death penalty. The judges on the appeals court criticized the length of the legal process. They said the case showed the gridlock and inefficiency of death penalty litigation. This meant the legal system had been too slow. After that appeal was decided, the legal process moved toward the execution. The execution was scheduled for the murder of Officer Richard Burke. This was the third murder Knight had committed. The state had to decide which crime to use for the execution warrant. They chose the murder of Officer Burke. This was the crime that had the most recent conviction and sentencing. The execution was scheduled for December 3, 2013. However, Knight's lawyers filed another appeal. They argued that the new drug used in the lethal injection could cause cruel and unusual punishment. The state was using a drug called midazolam hydrochloride. Knight's lawyers said this drug might not prevent pain during the execution. The Florida Supreme Court delayed the execution. They ordered a lower court judge to hold a hearing on the drug issue. The lower court held the hearing and heard the evidence. The court ruled that there was no evidence that the drug caused serious illness or needless suffering. The Florida Supreme Court agreed with this ruling. They lifted the stay of execution. Governor Rick Scott then rescheduled the execution. The new date was set for January 7, 2014. On January 7, 2014, the execution took place. It happened at the Florida State Prison in Stark, Florida. This was the same prison where Knight had been held for many years. It was also the same prison where he had killed Officer Richard Burke in 1980. Knight was 62 years old on the day of his execution. He had been on death row for almost 40 years. Only 2 other killers in the United States had spent more time on death row. He had been visited by his 4 sisters on the day before the execution. A friend visited him on the day of the execution. His family did not come to watch the execution. Before the execution began, Knight was asked if he had any final words. He answered, no. He did not make a statement. He did not apologize to the families of his victims. He was given his final meal. His last meal was mostly desserts. It included 1½ slices of sweet potato pie, 1 piece of coconut cake, half a loaf of banana nut bread, a quarter bottle of Sprite, 2 tablespoons of strawberries, butter pecan ice cream, a small container of vanilla ice cream, and a handful of Fritos corn chips. The execution started at 6:31 p.m. The lethal injection was given. Knight blinked his eyes a few times. Then his eyes closed. His breathing slowed down. The drugs took effect. At 6:45 p.m., a doctor pronounced him dead. The execution was over. He had been executed for the murder of Officer Richard Burke. Several people witnessed the execution. They watched from behind a glass window. Among them were Officer Burke's 2 daughters. Their names were Carolyn Burke Thompson and Margaret Della Vega. They were crying as they watched. They had waited 33 years for this moment. After the execution, Carolyn spoke to reporters. She said, "This is where my dad took his last breath." She said she was at peace. She said, "My daddy can finally rest in peace." 2 former co-workers of Officer Burke also attended. They had worked with him at the prison. The family of the Gans couple did not attend the execution. Their grandson, Judd Shapiro, spoke to reporters. He said the execution did not bring his grandparents back, but he said it was over. He said it allowed the family to move forward. He wished the process had not taken 40 years. He hoped that the case would show other people that justice could happen, even if it took a long time. A small group of people who opposed the death penalty protested outside the prison. They held signs and made their voices heard. But their protest did not stop the execution. The execution was delayed by about half an hour. This was because the United States Supreme Court was considering a final appeal. The court denied the appeal. The execution went forward. After the execution, Knight's body was taken away. His death sentence for the Gans murders was no longer relevant. He had already been executed for the Burke murder. The state of Florida had carried out its sentence. The legal process that had lasted for 4 decades was finally complete. The case of Thomas Knight, also known as Askari Abdullah Muhammad, was closed. Story 5. Kenneth Eugene Hogan was born on May 22, 1961, in the state of Oklahoma. He was a white male who grew up in a regular family. Like other children, he went to school, completed his education, and eventually became an adult. He later got married and had children of his own. Hogan was a father, and for a period of time, he lived what appeared to be a normal life. He attended church regularly, and it was there that he met Lisa Renee Stanley. Lisa was a young woman who often babysat for Hogan and his wife, which meant she spent time caring for their children. Their families knew each other, and over time, Hogan and Lisa became friends. Their relationship continued outside of church as well. Hogan would sometimes help Lisa with her schoolwork, and the two developed a close friendship. Hogan had a job and worked to support himself. However, his behavior was not always positive. He had problems with the law, and before the events that would later take place, Hogan had already committed several crimes. He had been involved in burglaries. He had also committed lewd molestation of a minor, which means he had touched a child in a wrongful way. In addition, he had used a minor to sell marijuana, meaning he had gotten a young person to sell drugs for him. Hogan had also threatened his co-workers and their families. These actions showed that he had a history of breaking the law and behaving in aggressive ways. At the time, Hogan had pending burglary charges. He was waiting for a court case involving accusations that he had stolen property. He was worried that these charges could lead to him going to prison. Hogan was married, and his wife knew about his criminal history. During this period, Hogan also talked about his own abilities. He told Lisa's husband, George Stanley, that he was taking a martial arts class. Hogan claimed that he was learning how to use a knife to cause a fatal injury. He even showed George a knife that he had brought with him. This made Lisa uncomfortable, and she told her husband that Hogan's behavior was making her nervous. Despite this, Hogan and Lisa continued to see each other. Lisa called his house many times, and in the year before the murder, Hogan's wife received between 30 and 35 phone calls from Lisa. Hogan and Lisa would also meet when her husband was not at home. Hogan had a temper and had threatened people in the past. He had a history of lying and trying to convince others to lie for him. He was also known to be manipulative. However, people also described him as having a good side. They said he was a loving father who paid attention to his children and helped members of his family. He once painted a house as a gift for a relative. While in jail, he acted as a helper and worked with a minister. Hogan was not always violent, but he had another side that included crimes against children and threats toward adults. He appeared to live a double life. To many people, he presented himself as a good church-going family man. But behind that image, he also had a criminal record and a history of making others feel afraid. Hogan's life before the murder was filled with contradictions. He attended church, had a wife and children, and had friendships like the one he shared with Lisa. At the same time, he had pending criminal charges, a history of burglaries, a conviction involving the molestation of a child, threats against others, and involvement in having a minor sell drugs. He was worried about going to prison, and he was a man who appeared normal on the outside while dealing with many serious problems underneath. He was also a man who was about to face a very serious situation involving his friend Lisa. Hogan continued with his daily routines. He went to work, attended church, and spent time with his family. He also continued visiting Lisa and helping her with her schoolwork. He spent time at her apartment when her husband was away. Their friendship was close, and some people questioned whether it was more than just a friendship. However, there was no proof that Hogan and Lisa had a sexual relationship. Hogan later said that he viewed Lisa like a sister. However, he also told a police officer that he had thought about having sex with her. According to Hogan, it was only a thought, and he did not act on it. The two continued their friendship, talking and spending time together. Hogan was a man dealing with a great deal of stress in his life. He had a family to support, legal problems to deal with, and a criminal past that could send him to prison. He also had a close friendship with a young married woman. This friendship was not completely hidden because Lisa's husband knew about it. However, Hogan and Lisa sometimes met without her husband's knowledge, creating a complicated situation. Hogan was a person who showed both positive and negative qualities. He was a father and a churchgoer. He was also a criminal who had threatened others. He was capable of kindness, but he was also capable of cruelty. He was approaching a point where all of these parts of his life would come together in a very tragic way. On the morning of January 28, 1988, Hogan woke up at his home and told his wife that he was going to work that day. However, this was not true. Instead of going to work, Hogan went to Lisa Stanley's apartment. Lisa was home alone that day. Earlier that morning, her husband, George Stanley, had been with her. Between 11 a.m. and 11:45 a.m., they had smoked marijuana together before George left for work. After he left, Lisa remained alone in the apartment. Hogan arrived around noon. He had gone there because Lisa had asked him to help her with a book report she was writing for school. This was something they normally did together. They often spent time with each other in this way. After Hogan arrived, he and Lisa smoked marijuana together. Hogan later claimed that the marijuana had been dipped in PCP, a strong drug. However, a medical test later showed that there was no PCP in Lisa's body, meaning that claim was not true. While they were together, Lisa asked Hogan to steal a stereo for her. She wanted him to get her a Pioneer stereo. Hogan refused. At the time, he already had burglary charges pending against him, meaning he was already facing legal trouble for stealing. He did not want to commit another burglary and risk being caught. Hogan told Lisa that he would not steal the stereo for her, and this refusal made her angry. The two friends began arguing, and the argument quickly became worse. Lisa became very upset and threw a coat rack down in anger. Hogan decided that he wanted to leave the apartment, but Lisa would not allow him to leave. She blocked his way. Hogan tried to calm her down. He placed his hand over her mouth to stop her from yelling. Lisa then threatened to scream. She said she would bang on the walls so the neighbors would hear. She also threatened to call the police and tell them that Hogan had tried to rape her. This was a serious threat for Hogan. He already had burglary charges against him, and a rape accusation could result in him going to prison. Lisa then ran into the bathroom and locked the door behind her. Hogan tried to talk to her through the door and attempted to reason with her, but she refused to come out. Hogan became angry. He kicked the bathroom door repeatedly until it broke open. Once he entered the bathroom, Hogan threatened Lisa. He told her that he would tell her husband and her mother about a secret from her past. He knew that Lisa had an abortion before she was married, and this was something she did not want others to know. Hogan threatened to reveal this information to everyone, which made Lisa very upset and angry. Lisa then ran toward the front door, trying to leave the apartment. However, Hogan reached the door first. He kicked it shut and blocked her from leaving. He repeated his threats, saying that he would tell her husband and mother about the abortion. At this point, the situation became very dangerous. Lisa had a wild look in her eyes and ran into the kitchen. She returned holding a large knife and pushed it toward Hogan. Hogan tried to grab the knife. He grabbed the blade, but Lisa pulled it back. As she pulled the knife away, the blade cut Hogan's hand. The cut was deep and painful, and his hand began bleeding heavily. Lisa swung the knife at Hogan again. This time, Hogan grabbed the knife from her hand and took it away. Lisa then ran back toward the kitchen. Hogan believed she was going to get another knife. Hogan was afraid. He was also afraid that Lisa would call the police and accuse him of trying to rape her. He believed the police would believe her because he had a criminal record, while Lisa was a young married woman. He thought her story would result in him going to prison. This fear made Hogan angry and frightened at the same time. Hogan chased after Lisa and caught up with her. He used the knife he had taken from her and stabbed her repeatedly. He stabbed her 25 times, cutting her head, neck, chest, and back. He also cut her throat. The cuts were deep, and many of them would have been fatal on their own. Lisa tried to defend herself and had cuts on her hands from attempting to block the knife. She remained alive during most of the attack. As Hogan continued stabbing her, Lisa moved through different areas of the apartment. The attack began in the kitchen and continued as she moved from the kitchen to the bathroom and then to the living room. The final stabs happened in the living room. Lisa was conscious and aware of what was happening to her. She suffered before she died. Her blood was found in several rooms of the apartment, and the large amount of blood showed that she had been suffering for a long time before her death. After Lisa was dead, Hogan did not leave immediately. He stayed inside the apartment and tried to make the crime scene appear as if someone else had committed the murder. He knocked over the television, emptied the contents of Lisa's purse onto the floor, and turned over furniture. He wanted it to look like a robbery had taken place and that an unknown intruder had fought with Lisa. Hogan also took the bathroom rug because it had his blood on it from his injured hand. He removed the rug and burned it so police would not find his blood at the scene. He also cleaned his hand wound by washing his hand in the bathroom sink. He tried to remove any blood evidence connected to him. After cleaning up as much as he could, Hogan left Lisa's apartment and drove to a hospital emergency room. He went to Moore Hospital and arrived around 1:45 p.m. He needed medical treatment for the deep cut on his hand. When hospital staff admitted him, they asked how he had been injured. Hogan gave them conflicting stories. He told one version of what happened and then changed it by giving a different explanation. He could not keep his story consistent. The doctor who treated him said Hogan appeared nervous. However, the doctor also said Hogan did not seem to be suffering from an emotional disturbance. He did not appear to be under the influence of drugs either. Hogan's hand injury was serious and required surgery from a surgeon to repair. Later, after leaving the hospital, Hogan spoke with his wife. He asked her to lie to the police for him. He told her to say that he had been at home all day on January 28th and that he had never left the house. He also asked her to say that he had cut his hand in the garage at home. Hogan wanted his wife to provide him with a false alibi and claim that he had been with her the entire day. He believed his wife would lie for him and help keep police from suspecting that he had been at Lisa's apartment. The police began investigating Lisa's murder. Her husband, George Stanley, returned home around 8:15 p.m. that evening and found his wife's body on the floor of the living room. He immediately called the police. When officers arrived at the apartment, they saw furniture that had been knocked over. They found Lisa's body, a bloody bathroom sink, and a large butcher knife. Investigators collected evidence from the scene, including hair samples, fiber samples, and blood samples. They also collected carpet from the apartment. The police found no signs of forced entry. This meant that Lisa had allowed the person into the apartment and likely knew the person. Investigators began looking for suspects, and Hogan was one of the people they considered because he was Lisa's friend and often visited her. The police attempted to speak with Hogan, but at first he avoided them. He did not want to talk with detectives and refused to cooperate. He was trying to hide what he had done. Investigators also spoke with Hogan's wife. She told them the truth. She said Hogan had not been home on the day of the murder and that she did not know where he had been. She also told police that Hogan had asked her to lie. She explained that he had wanted her to say he had been home all day. Instead of protecting her husband with a false story, she told police the truth. When Hogan learned that his wife had revealed his request to lie, he realized he was in serious trouble. He could no longer continue pretending that he was innocent. 1 week after the murder, on February 3, 1988, Hogan went to the Oklahoma City Police Department. He agreed to be interviewed by Detective Bob Horn. During the interview, Hogan first told some lies and gave inconsistent statements. He struggled to keep his story straight. However, the detective continued questioning him, and eventually Hogan admitted the truth. He confessed to killing Lisa Stanley and gave a detailed account of what had happened that day. He described the argument, Lisa attacking him with the knife, and how he took the knife from her and stabbed her. Hogan also admitted that he had arranged the apartment to make it appear as though a robbery had occurred. He admitted that he had burned the rug containing his blood. He told police everything, and his confession was recorded as a detailed statement explaining what he had done. Although Hogan confessed, he gave a different explanation for why he killed Lisa. He later claimed that he had acted in self-defense. Hogan said Lisa attacked him with the knife first, and that he was only defending himself when he took the weapon from her. He claimed that he did not intend to kill her, and that the stabbing happened during a moment of panic. He said that he was not in control of his actions. He described the stabbing as if he was watching someone else commit the act. Hogan said, "It was stabbing her and I couldn't stop him." He claimed that he did not realize he had killed Lisa until the following day. He said he never intended to hurt her, and that his fear of being falsely accused of rape caused him to act. According to Hogan, that fear led him to lose control. This was his version of what happened. At this point, police had Hogan's confession recorded on tape. They had physical evidence from the crime scene. They had Hogan's blood on his clothing, his injured hand that required surgery, his wife's testimony about his request for a false alibi, and his conflicting statements at the hospital. The evidence against Hogan was very strong. He had admitted to killing Lisa, but one major question remained. Was this murder committed with malice and the intent to kill, or was it manslaughter committed in the heat of passion? That question would ultimately be decided by a jury. Hogan was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. This was a capital crime, meaning he could face the death penalty. After Hogan confessed to the police on February 3, 1988, he was arrested and taken into custody. Investigators now had his detailed confession recorded on tape. They also had physical evidence from the crime scene, including blood samples and the knife used in the attack. They had Hogan's blood-covered clothing, his injured hand that required surgery, and his wife's testimony that he had asked her to lie for him. The case against Hogan was very strong. He was formally charged with first-degree murder, which was a capital offense. If convicted, he could receive the death penalty. Hogan's first trial took place later in 1988. During the trial, the jury heard all of the evidence against him. They listened to Hogan's recorded confession, viewed photographs from the crime scene and of Lisa's body, and heard testimony from experts about the blood patterns found in the apartment. They also heard from the medical examiner, who explained the 25 stab wounds Lisa suffered. The prosecution argued that Hogan had acted with malice aforethought, meaning he had a deliberate intention to kill. They pointed to the number of stab wounds and the fact that Lisa was conscious during much of the attack. They argued that these details showed Hogan intended to take her life. Hogan's defense team presented a different argument. They claimed that he had acted in the heat of passion. They said Lisa had provoked him by attacking him with the knife, and that he was afraid she would falsely accuse him of rape. The defense asked the jury to consider a lesser charge of manslaughter instead of first-degree murder. However, the trial judge refused to give the jury an instruction on first-degree manslaughter. The judge only allowed the jury to choose between first-degree murder and acquittal. After deliberating, The jury found Hogan guilty of first-degree murder. The same jury then moved into the sentencing phase, where they had to decide whether Hogan should receive life in prison, life without parole, or the death penalty. The prosecution argued for the death penalty. They presented evidence of aggravating circumstances, including their claim that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. They also argued that Hogan represented a continuing threat to society. They presented evidence of his past crimes, including burglaries and the molestation of a minor. The jury found only one aggravating circumstance, that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. They did not find that Hogan was a continuing threat to society. On November 3, 1988, the jury sentenced Kenneth Eugene Hogan to death by lethal injection. Hogan appealed both his conviction and his death sentence. The Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the case, and in 1994, the court affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence. The court rejected Hogan's argument that the trial judge should have given the jury a manslaughter instruction. They found that the evidence did not support a heat-of-passion defense. They also ruled that the aggravating circumstance of the murder being heinous, atrocious, or cruel was supported by the evidence. Hogan then filed a petition for post-conviction relief in state court, but that request was denied. After that, he took his case to federal court. Hogan filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus in the United States District Court for the Western District of Oklahoma. In 1998, the district court denied his petition. Hogan appealed the decision to the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. In 1999, the 10th Circuit reversed the lower court's decision. The appeals court ruled that Hogan's due process rights had been violated. They determined that the trial judge should have instructed the jury on first-degree manslaughter as a lesser-included offense. The court relied on the Supreme Court case Beck v. Alabama. That case stated that in a capital trial, the jury must be allowed to consider a lesser offense if the evidence supports that possibility. The 10th Circuit found that Hogan's confession provided enough evidence for a reasonable jury to find him guilty of manslaughter instead of murder. Because of this, they ordered that Hogan receive a new trial. The state of Oklahoma appealed the decision to the United States Supreme Court. However, in 2000, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. This meant the 10th Circuit's decision remained in place, and Hogan would receive a second trial. Hogan's retrial took place from March 24 to April 4, 2003. The trial was held in Oklahoma County, and Judge Tammy Bass-Jones presided over the case. The prosecutors were Robert Macy, Sandra Elliott, and Susan Lavenue. Hogan's defense attorneys were Catherine Hammerstein and Anthony McKesson. The prosecution presented the same evidence from the first trial, including Hogan's confession, the blood evidence, the knife, and testimony from witnesses. Hogan again argued that he had acted in the heat of passion. This time, the trial judge did give the jury an instruction on first-degree manslaughter. The jury was allowed to consider both murder and manslaughter. After deliberation, the jury once again found Hogan guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing phase followed. The prosecution again requested the death penalty. They presented evidence supporting the heinous, atrocious, or cruel aggravating circumstance. They also presented evidence supporting the continuing threat aggravator again. Hogan's defense team presented mitigating evidence. They called 9 witnesses who spoke about his positive qualities. They said he was a loving father, a good worker, and a helpful person. They also said he was active in his church. The defense asked the jury to spare Hogan's life. The jury considered all of the evidence. They did not find the continuing threat aggravator. However, they did find that the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel. The jury decided that this aggravating circumstance outweighed the mitigating evidence presented by the defense. The jury again sentenced Hogan to death. The trial court officially sentenced him accordingly on May 28, 2003. Hogan appealed his second conviction and death sentence to the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals. He raised several arguments. He argued that the jury instructions regarding heat of passion manslaughter were flawed. He claimed the trial court should have instructed the jury that the state had to disprove heat of passion beyond a reasonable doubt. He also argued that the state should not have been allowed to present the continuing threat aggravator again because his first jury had rejected it. Hogan claimed this violated double jeopardy. In 2006, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction and death sentence. The court rejected all of Hogan's arguments. The court ruled that the jury instructions were adequate. They also said Hogan's double jeopardy argument was not valid because the first jury had not acquitted him of the death penalty. Instead, they had simply not found that specific aggravating circumstance. The court also rejected Hogan's other claims involving the exculpatory statement instruction and the admission of victim impact evidence. The death sentence was upheld. Hogan again sought federal habeas corpus relief. In 2011, the United States District Court for the Western District of Oklahoma denied his petition. Hogan appealed to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. In 2013, the 10th Circuit affirmed the district court's decision. The court found that the Oklahoma court's rulings were reasonable. They determined that the trial court's failure to give a specific instruction requiring the state to disprove heat of passion was not a violation of clearly established federal law. The 10th Circuit also found that Hogan's claims regarding mitigation evidence and the exculpatory statement instruction did not justify relief. His appeal was denied, and he had exhausted all of his legal appeals. Hogan then sought clemency from the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board. He asked the board to recommend that his death sentence be changed to life in prison. In January 2014, the board held a hearing. Members of Lisa's family submitted letters to the board. They wrote that they had suffered for 26 years because of the repeated appeals. They said they wanted closure and wanted the execution to proceed. The board voted on Hogan's clemency request. The vote was 4-1 against granting clemency. His request was denied, leaving Hogan with no remaining legal options. On January 23, 2014, Hogan was scheduled to be executed. The execution took place at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. The scheduled time was 6 p.m. Hogan was brought into the death chamber and strapped to a gurney. The execution team inserted 2 intravenous lines, 1 in each arm. They prepared the 3 drugs used for lethal injection. The first drug was sodium thiopental or pentobarbital, which causes unconsciousness. The second drug was vecuronium bromide, which stops breathing. The third drug was potassium chloride, which stops the heart. The executioners injected the drugs by hand using syringes. Before the drugs were administered, Hogan was given the opportunity to speak his final words. He said, "I am guilty for what I'm here for, and I take full responsibility for my actions. And to Lisa's family, I say I'm sorry that I can't undo it. And I'm sorry to my family for all the pain I've caused." He thanked the family members who had come to witness his death. After the drugs began entering his body, Hogan said, "There's a chemical taste in my mouth. I'm going. I'm going. I'm going." His face turned ashen, and he took his final breaths. About 6 minutes passed from the time the drugs were administered until he was pronounced dead. At 6:13 p.m. on January 24, 2014, Kenneth Eugene Hogan was officially declared dead. After the execution, Lisa's mother, Norma Tressler, released a statement. She said that Hogan had never attempted to make amends with her family. She said he had shown absolutely no remorse for his actions. She said that after 26 years of waiting, she finally had closure. The family had been forced to relive the tragedy repeatedly throughout the appeals process. Now it was finally over. Hogan was the 109th person executed in Oklahoma since 1976. He was the fifth person executed in the United States in 2014. The case of Lisa Renee Stanley was finally closed. The man who took her life had paid for his crime with his own life. Justice, as defined by the state of Oklahoma, had been served. Hogan's death ended the long legal battle that had lasted more than a quarter of a century. Lisa Stanley's family could finally begin to heal. Kenneth Eugene Hogan was buried, and the story of his crime and punishment reached its final conclusion.